I think a lot of people are sometimes afraid to have dialogue because they feel like doing so means they have to be open to changing their mind.
It's just so necessary to have compassion, to understand, because you mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily about changing your mind, more so understanding where that perspective comes from.
Hello, and welcome to this originally produced podcast collaboration with the University of Central Florida's Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives and Ginsberg Family Foundation's Phoenix Generation. I'm Ashley LaFlame, the Conflict Transformation Fellow for the Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives, here with Samantha Romero, who will be representing Phoenix Generation. Today, we are joined by Shira Hoffer. Shira is a 2025 Harvard College graduate with a degree in social studies and religion, and she is passionate about seeking out meaningful and productive disagreements across political, religious, and social divides. With a formal background in small claims court mediation, she is the founding executive director of the Viewpoints Project, a student-focused national nonprofit fostering cultures of curiosity towards disagreement in education. Shira's dedicated career leads as an example of the Central Florida Pledge, as she shows us how to make an impact, stand together, and start building bridges together as a community. Shira, thank you on behalf of both GPII and Phoenix Generation for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, everyone. Shira, we are honored to have you on our podcast today. I mean, an expert in our field in exactly what we do here, dialogue across differences, and your tagline being disagree curiously. Yeah, so thank you so much. So, your academic and professional journey is one which embraces the uncomfortable. Your interdisciplinary work leads conversation many are way too scared to start. Could you tell us what inspired your study of constructive disagreement?
Sure. Well, thank you both for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation. And I've always loved it. I think that disagreement for a lot of people is scary and uncomfortable, and I get that. And I also think it can be super rewarding, and I kind of attribute that feeling, I guess, to a few things. One is I just grew up in a very kind of conflict-healthy family. We used to have these family meetings, and we would bring kind of concerns or questions to each other and talk them through. One time, this is like a notable family meeting. I was probably 11, my brother was 7, and he brought this list, and it was like 17 things I don't like about Shira. And I think a lot of people would have been like, oh my God, like that's so terrible, whatever. But in my family, we always had a bowl of M&Ms at our family meeting, and we sat down and we were like, all right, let's go through the list. And some of the things on the list were like, I don't like it when Shira like punches me in the kitchen randomly with no explanation. So that was like, okay, Shira, like you shouldn't punch your brother. But then other things was like, Shira laughs too loud. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of like, okay, but people can't really control the way they laugh. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's something we just have to be tolerant of. So that's kind of how I grew up. We would talk about stuff, the hard stuff, the uncomfortable stuff, and really like have a good atmosphere around it. And I went to then a pluralistic Jewish high school where I moved in with family friends in a different state, went to this high school. And the whole idea was like, how can we be in community with each other? Because we're all Jewish, despite practicing Judaism very differently. And there was a lot of intentionality around, okay, what does it mean that they do this and I do this? And how do we still be in community? And how can we talk about it? And that was the atmosphere, again, that I kind of grew up in. And so coming to college, I was kind of looking forward to that same kind of in-depth engagement atmosphere, and found that it was much harder, I think, on my campus than I expected. And so sought out opportunities to continue to be in that environment while I was still in school, and which eventually led to the Viewpoints Project.
Wow. It's interesting that you say that. Typically, college is many people's first introduction to diverse viewpoints and having these tough conversations. So it's really interesting to hear that you kind of like just grew up in that environment. Very fitting.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. With you having that background, it seems like you're a natural in curious disagreement.
I don't know about that.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk about the Viewpoints Project. For our listeners, the Viewpoints Project is a nonprofit organization which challenges students to disagree curiously and embrace thoughtful conversations across different perspectives, even if it does include a list about 17 things wrong with Shira. But could you tell us a little more about your mission with the Viewpoints Project and what the program offers to achieve it?
Sure, I'm happy to, but I first want to, you said this offhand, but I want to kind of address, like, I'm not a natural at curious disagreement. I may have grown up more exposed to it than others, but I think there's this misconception that like all of us, maybe you too, like those of us who work, you too, in the dialogue space, that we're like these perfect dialogue, never make a mistake, whatever. Like, no. If I get really heated about something, I might yell. Like my mom and I, one time we got in this big argument and she was like, how come you're yelling at me? Like, don't you work in this space anyway? And it's like, it's a good reminder that I should, continue to practice what I preach and to engage with dialogue skills. But we're not perfect, those of us who work in dialogue. And I think it's important to remember that this is a really difficult thing to do that we're trying to teach. If it wasn't difficult, our organization, the Phoenix Generation, we wouldn't exist. And so I guess I just don't want anyone to think that this is, super easy. It's really hard. And so at the Viewpoints Project, the way that we try and affect change toward curious disagreement is through two programs. We do middle and high school consulting. We work with middle and high schools, typically over longer term periods, maybe with a focus group of teachers or students or both, to help them think about how can we create a culture in our school where curiosity toward disagreement is the norm. And that could be helping teachers learn better facilitation skills. It could be helping students develop more active listening skills, helping people create projects in their schools, initiatives, curricular changes, all led kind of by college student and slightly older facilitators to create this bridge where we're relatable to the students because we're maybe the age of their older siblings. And for the teachers, we're able to kind of bridge this professional gap where we understand where their students are coming from because our siblings are the same age, or maybe we were just that age a couple of years ago, and yet we can still help them understand some kind of more professional facilitation skills. So that's the middle and high school work that we do. And then on the college space, we really, before we started, we did a landscape analysis. Like what exists out there? How can we make sure that we're addressing a gap, or else we should just all go work for another organization? And that's not that there are tons of amazing organizations working in this space. And the gap that we identified was around two things, around student leadership. How can we have programs that are run by students for students? And how can we reach kind of not the choir? Like people talk about there's a preaching to the choir problem in dialogue, where the people who come to dialogue trainings, they're the people who want to go to dialogue trainings, and they're not the people who need the dialogue trainings. So our program is focused on reaching club leaders on campus, people who have social spheres of influence, and helping them understand how curious disagreement skills can help them reach goals that they've already set for themselves. So the head of the hip hop organizations at Elon University is a fellow this year, and she learned at our retreat, like all of these skills around dialogue, and really liked the case study method that we did. We did a case study, everybody talked about it, learned skills to talk about it, but she does hip hop. So she wrote a case study about hip hop and controversies in the hip hop community and led a workshop for the hip hop club, how to talk about controversy in hip hop. And what I love about that is that's not like be a civic dialogue champion. That's like we want to do hip hop. How are these skills going to help us be better at hip hop? So that's the fellowship that we run. We hire mentors who are college students to run the program for fellows who are also college students. So really trying to have a near peer train the trainer model. I founded the organization when I was a student, when I was a junior, and when I graduated just in May, I'm lucky enough to now be the full-time executive director. So it's really been a wonderful experience, and I'm happy to be here and talk more about it.
That's fantastic. What a fantastic opportunity to, I guess, go beyond typical civic disagreement, especially when it comes to college. As you mentioned, when you've been in college spaces, students are more excited to disagree. You brought that up this morning. But yeah, thank you so much for being here again. Samantha.
Yeah, what I really like is the practical application. I mean, we work in this space, so it's one thing to be, like civic discourse, but for the everyday college student, it really is just normal conversations. Congratulations, by the way, on graduating. Engaging in conversations across viewpoints is no easy task, and some people choose to avoid talking on it at all. These conversations can be uncomfortable, but you have acknowledged that they are not only important, but necessary. Despite the discomfort, why are they necessary? What benefit do we as people and as a society gain from these difficult conversations?
Yeah, we could spend the whole podcast talking about that. So when we were beginning our journey as an organization, one thing we really wanted to understand is the science behind curious disagreement and why it's important. If there is real data behind why it's important, and if so, what does that data say? And there's just so many, like it's hard to overstate the importance of this type of engagement. And I would say that it falls into several categories. The first is actually an academic category, especially when we're working in schools. Studies suggest that approaching differences with curiosity, just being curious in general, leaning into disagreements, leaning into multiple viewpoints, helps promote things like critical independent thinking or creativity or focus in the face or perseverance in the face of challenging issues. Like there's all sorts of academic benefits that we can see. And even if there weren't any academic benefits, we also all live together in society. Like maybe we live halfway across the country, or maybe we live right next door, but we know people that we disagree with on all sorts of things. Some of those things are like those political hot button issues. And some of those things are like, what's the best Indian restaurant in town? And so if we're going to have these disagreements anyway, if it's inevitable, then we might as well learn the skills to be able to do so well because we're doing it in the first place. And so there's also this idea that if we can not only understand what the other person thinks, but if we can understand why they think it and ask them questions to deepen our understanding of why they believe what they believe, that helps us build connections across differences. We don't have to always talk about the hard things, but if we do, we kind of have the skills to do so because we care about the person who has those skills. So one point that I want to make is when we talk about curious disagreement, that's our tagline, disagree curiously. Sometimes people think that's an oxymoron. That's like you can't have both. You can either disagree or you can be curious, but you can't do both at the same time. And the reason we picked disagree curiously as our tagline is exactly to kind of combat that misconception. That I think a lot of people are sometimes afraid to have dialogue because they feel like doing so means they have to be open to changing their mind. And I think changing your mind is great. If you have a thought and then you hear something else, you're like, I'm going to change my mind. Fine, I'm not against it. But I do think that the idea that you can have your belief and be unwilling to change your mind and nevertheless be curious to understand why someone else thinks differently, that framework, I think, gives people a little bit more freedom to engage with curious disagreement or engage across differences because you're no longer asking them to threaten their own viewpoints or perspectives. And so when we talk about curious disagreement, we're thinking about the academic benefits, we're thinking about the social benefits, and then we're also just thinking about what can we enable or open for students as opportunities when the majority of students want to be having difficult conversations but don't know how or are afraid to do so.
That's fantastic. I really like your emphasis on not having to change your opinion, but being there to disagree curiously across these perspectives. And we can see it even with global impact. At GPII, we recently had the former Prime Minister of Ireland, Bertie Ahern, come and visit to speak to students about conflict transformation. And one of his main perspectives was about with conflict transformation, you have to bring these different groups to the table. Whether it's at the pub or out on the town, you have to bring these different groups to the table to have a conversation. And whether it's about the agreement itself or about their lives, that's where change happens. So thank you for discussing that. So going back to that fear, the fear of discomfort from disagreement is something your work encourages students to not only acknowledge, but overcome. Were you always afraid of disagreement? And if you were, could you share with us how you overcame your own fears of discomfort when creating a dialogue?
I don't know that I was always afraid of disagreement. I think kind of from my background, it was a lot more normalized for me. And that's one, I think, big point is like if you grow up in an environment where there's lots of different perspectives, you engage with it meaningfully, it feels way less scary. But for, as you mentioned, kind of the people who are in a bit of a bubble until they come to college, it feels super scary to kind of ask those big questions, talk to new people. And it's definitely been scary for me too. I can think of one experience where in 8th grade, I went on an interfaith trip to Israel and the West Bank. And we, one night, were invited to our bus driver's house for dinner. Our bus driver lived in East Jerusalem, in an area that's contested whether or not it's part of Israel. And as we were kind of on the bus driving there was all sorts of graffiti on the walls of like people with knives or like dripping blood, like violent graffiti against Israelis. And I was sitting I'm not Israeli, I am Jewish. And I was there kind of being like, this is pretty scary. Like, I'm a little nervous about this neighborhood. And so I was very apprehensive kind of going into their house. And as soon as I walked in the door, like all my fears kind of melted away. They like had these platters of food. They were so happy to see us. They kissed us on both cheeks, like told us stories about their family. We met their kids. They performed this dance. It was just like, I left thinking this family is just like my extended family. They just, dress differently, believe different stuff, live in a different place. But we were able to kind of humanize each other by sharing this meal together, by sharing space together. And they talked about like here are ways that the Israeli military has made our lives worse. And so because of that, we harbor negative feelings toward the Israeli government. But we don't have negative feelings about, you Jewish people who are currently eating our food and sitting in our house. And that was a huge kind of eye-opening moment. And I think I felt like if I could be in that environment and be so warmly welcomed, then a conversation on a college campus feels a lot more accessible, I guess. And I also, so that's one story, I guess, that maybe answers your question. And the other is that I really like to think of curious disagreement as a practice. That the first time, it's super scary. The second time, it's still probably super scary. But maybe the fifth time, it feels a little bit more approachable. And there's skills and language that we can use that can make it easier. And so if you mess up one time, like I mess up all the time, you mess up one time, that's okay. Just try again next time. Like try and do it a little better. Ask a more open-ended question next time. Don't interrupt the person. Listen a little bit more. Like just because it's hard for you once or now doesn't mean it's going to be hard forever. If you commit to practicing it, just like you would practice a sport or a musical instrument or anything else.
With practicing language and building those constructive questions, I believe at breakfast today you mentioned do not don't. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So we have this kind of phrase that we like to use. It's my favorite tip around dialogue. We call it do not don't. And it's basically suggesting that when you're asking questions, they should begin with words like do, as in do you think, or would it be the case? Is it the case? As opposed to don't you think, wouldn't it be better? Isn't it the case? Because those are not questions. Actually, those are accusations with question marks at the end to make you feel like a little bit more friendly. So, So when we're asking something like, do you like bananas versus don't you like bananas? It's very clear that don't you like bananas is I assume you like bananas and I'm clarifying that my assumption about you is correct. Whereas do you like bananas is like, tell me your thoughts on bananas. Like, do you like them? Do you not like them? So it's a silly example, but suddenly if you say, don't you hate what ICE is doing right now versus do you hate what ICE is doing right now? Again, two very different questions, different tones, ways that the do you think, everybody likes to talk about themselves and what they think. So if you can even talk about practice, like just try this later today, like pay attention if you ask a question. How did you start the question? Could you start it differently next time? And see how that really opens up conversations that used to put people on the defensive to invite them to share their perspective and to learn more.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so your creation of the hotline for Israel-Palestine approached the complex political and cultural division on the conflict through encouraging conversation across barriers rather than avoiding it. What advice do you have for students seeking to approach politically and culturally complex topics sensitively? When politics becomes intertwined with culture and identity, how can we be mindful with our questions, keeping in mind that religious and ethnic conflict is at the forefront of many conflicts today?
Yeah, another topic we could spend the whole podcast talking about. I think the do not don't and other kind of language tricks, whether that's asking open-ended questions, not interrupting people. I think sometimes people feel like those are either pejorative or pedantic, like talking down to people. They can feel that way, but I really am like a true believer in these tips that sound so easy and the ability to transform a conversation. So the first thing I would say is like, make it a practice. Like, can you once a day ask an open-ended question? Or can you once a week try and do some research about a perspective that you didn't know too much about? Like, data suggests that, have you ever seen, like, if you make a New Year's resolution to go to the gym 4 times a week and you've never gone to the gym in your life, you're going to fail. You are not going to go to the gym 4 times a week. But if you say, I'm going to go once a week for half an hour, and then in a month, I'm going to reevaluate. It's the same kind of thing. It's all about practice. So can you pick a practice that works for you? The other is, I think, to recognize that the fear that you have about the conversation is probably the same fear that the other person has about it too. So you're kind of both afraid of each other and not really addressing the elephant in the room, which is that fear. And so one thing that I sometimes do, I did this earlier today at a different lunch meeting. I was talking about the hotline. I was talking about it with a mix of Jewish and Muslim students. And I noticed I started to get a little bit anxious because I thought maybe some of the students would be in favor and some of them would be against. And so I just kind of paused and I was like, guys, like, just so you know, I'm a little anxious about this conversation. I really don't want to say anything that offends you, but I also want to explain what we're doing. I really hope that you'll give me some grace, and I'm happy to answer your questions or to hear your pushback, if you have. And I think that it certainly lessened my anxiety, and I hope that it lessened theirs too. And so a takeaway from that, I think, is if you want to talk about something and you're nervous about it, and you want to talk about it with like your roommate, let's say, go up to your roommate and be like, hey, I want to talk about this with you, but I'm worried, we live together. I don't want to make things awkward. Like, are you willing to talk about it with me? And if so, like, what guidelines can we put in place so that it goes really well? And that also sounds kind of silly and awkward and like it would be a really strange thing to do. But I think it allows everybody to kind of exhale a little bit and realize, one of you mentioned this, I don't remember which one, that students actually want this. The data suggests, and our experience has been, that students cheer when we tell them, today we're going to talk about abortion, or today we're going to talk about pronouns, or whatever it might be. Whereas when we give them kind of silly scenarios that are kind of fake, it's like, oh, here's another workshop where we practice fake stuff. So if everyone wants to be talking about it and everyone's nervous, can we just acknowledge the anxiety and then kind of push through it together?
100%. I think that nowadays, especially with students, at least on my campus, I feel like there is this increased need for comfortability and community of, not comfortability, but community, but also transparency and just being able to have different viewpoints and to engage in conversation. And, it's refreshing to be able to hold those spaces. And you mentioned on campus earlier. Oh, something I really like that you mentioned was also the practice of doing. And earlier you also said that you're not the perfect conversationalist, and that goes to active listening too. All these things are circulating in my mind where it's not as intimidating to start, just try, incorporate it. And, you'll never know where it takes off. But yeah.
Or even if it is intimidating, like, remember that everyone else feels intimidated too. Yeah. There's kind of like this joint fear that I think can then serve to reduce fear. So I guess I don't want to say that it's easy or that it's not intimidating. Like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, just do it. It's like not minimizing that hard.
It, yeah.
Like there's actually, and I'm not sure that this is one of the questions, but I think it's important. There are true like neurological factors that make this type of engagement difficult. There's a part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. Now we're getting really academic, whose job is to sort information that we receive into categories that we're familiar with. Why? Because we receive millions of inputs every second, and we need to be able to sort through them, or else we would just walk around the world like, oh my God, what the heck is happening? That's a process that we need biologically. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to function efficiently in the world. The problem is that same kind of sorting algorithm, if you will, we use it on people because we don't really discriminate in that process. A tree, a light bulb, a chair, a table, a person, a bird, like they all are things that we see and that we therefore sort. But the problem is that people don't fit into categories like chairs and tables do. And so lest you feel like, I can't do this, it's so hard, it's so scary, how come I can't do it? You start judging yourself, you're judging others for having a hard time. Like, there are true processes that are subconscious and necessary for our brains to survive that asking people to do this is asking them to overcome. So I guess I just don't want you guys or listeners to feel like I should be able to do this or they should be able to do this. Like, we can do this, but it takes practice. It takes skill. It is intimidating and for a good biological reason. And we just need to know that so that we can actively try and overcome it. So one exercise that we do at Viewpoints that I really like is called Common Ground Bingo. And it was actually introduced to me at a conference at Brigham Young University where a bunch of us were coming together. It was called the Peacemaking Conference. And we had a lot of people kind of coming together from different campuses, learning these bridge building skills. We had this game where it was a bingo board and there were different topics in each square. And we had to go up to each other and say, like, maybe the topic was like free healthcare. Like, do you believe in free healthcare? Yes or no? If you didn't agree on the perspective, you had to ask one curious question of the other person about their perspective and then find one piece of common ground. That's why it's called Common Ground Bingo. And what I loved about, I was super apprehensive at first because a bunch of people I had just met and it was a very diverse crowd. And the topics were like immigration and healthcare and wealth tax, like all these things that are hot button issues. And it was the highlight of the retreat. Like, I met all sorts of people that I really disagreed with stuff on. I had this one conversation with a BYU student where the topic was actually abortion. And he was like, I'm opposed to abortion. And I was like, oh, it's interesting. I'm not 100% opposed to abortion. Like, tell me more about why you don't believe in abortion. And he gave me this really interesting answer that came both from his faith and his family experience and all of these things. And then he asked me, like, tell me more about your perspective. And so I told him about my thoughts about, female the autonomy of the mother on the one hand, but also acknowledging that different traditions see the fetus in different ways. And then we found common ground around his argument really was people should be responsible for their own choices. So if you make the choice to have sex, then you have to accept the consequences, especially unprotected sex, that you might become pregnant. But because his whole argument was based around agency and choice making, he felt that in cases of rape, that abortion should be allowed because there was no agency on the part of the woman. The woman didn't make the decision, and therefore she should be free to have an abortion. And that was really interesting because I had never thought about an argument against abortion that was actually framed in terms of agency and autonomy. I've always heard like autonomy on the pro-choice side instead of on the pro-life side. And so it was really eye-opening that it felt like it was like one of the most contentious topics on the page. One student from BYU, one student from Harvard, like very different people. He was a guy, I was a girl. And we just had this really wonderful conversation where the goal was to ask curious questions and then to come to some common ground despite disagreement. And we now use that game all the time. We did it with Phoenix Generation yesterday. And what gives me hope is that every time we've done that game, students have been, the energy in the room has been joyful and excited. And students have talked about really hard things, but it's felt like, yes, we finally get to talk about hard things. I want to learn more about you instead of like, oh, we have to shy away from those topics. So that was a really impactful conversation for me, an impactful lesson that we now run in our organization, and I'm grateful for it.
No, immediately what came to mind was Unify America. Are you familiar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Guys, you have to take part of this opportunity. Phoenix Generation has a certain number of allotted spots to participate in Unify America with basically Unify America is exactly what Shira said. You kind of like are, well, not really exactly, but but similarly, Unify America essentially is a initiative that is for college age students where you are paired with another college student that has differing beliefs than you do. And you are on this Zoom call with them and you are talking about different issues and kind of exploring why you think that way. And that immediately reminded me of that. And it's just so necessary to have compassion, to understand, because you mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily about changing your mind, more so understanding where that perspective comes from. So thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Let me talk about one other framework actually that I think is useful. I know you didn't ask about it, but
I would love to hear.
You just mentioned when you were talking about understanding and being compassionate. I mentioned my background is in mediation. So there's a famous story in kind of the conflict resolution or mediation world that talks about an orange. There's one orange. Have you guys heard this story? Maybe?
No, I haven't actually. This is surprisingly. No.
So there's one orange, and there's two kids, and they're fighting over the orange, who gets the orange. And one kid's, I want the orange, I want the orange. And the parents finally get exasperated, come into the room, cut the orange in half, give each kid half the orange, and they're like, be quiet. Like, you now each have half the orange. And they think they've solved the problem. And then the kids keep screaming at each other. And the parents kind of come back, and they're like, what is going on? Like, why are you still yelling at each other? And one kid is like, well, I ate my half of the orange and I'm still hungry. And the other kid is like, I zested half of my peel and I still need more for my carrot cake. And it's like, oh, like we thought that you both wanted the orange. But if we had asked, why do you want the orange? We would have understood, well, one of you wants a peel and one of you wants the fruit, and we could peel it and give one of you the fruit and one of you the peel and solve the problem. It's like an apocryphal story. I'm not sure it ever happened. And it's basically about how to build consensus by asking questions. But it highlights this idea of positions and interests. Position, I want the orange. No, I want the orange. Interest, I'm hungry. I want to make a carrot cake. And so while we don't talk a lot about consensus at the Viewpoints Project, we do think a lot about interests and positions. So if somebody has, and that's kind of where the compassion, the understanding the story comes in. One person can be, an example I like to use around the Second Amendment. One person can be super pro guns. Everyone has the right to have a gun. Someone can say, no, guns make society dangerous. We don't want to have guns in society. You ask them, well, why do you think that? And one person says, you know, well, I was robbed once in the middle of the night and I felt like I couldn't protect my family and it was so scary. And if I had had a gun, I would have felt like a better, you know, husband or something like that. And the other person says, my kid was in a school shooting. And if there hadn't been that gun, my kid would not be scared to go to school. And so suddenly you realize both people are trying to protect their families, but they arrive there in different ways. And so you could then talk about how could you build like a bipartisan gun bill around that? Or you could just say, wow, we understand each other a lot better. We want to eat the orange, zest the peel. We want to protect our families. And that leads us to different conclusions. There's all sorts of work that can be done with that curiosity and the compassion about who the person is beyond kind of the tagline or the headline perspective that they hold. And I think that story about the orange is like a fun but like thoughtful illustration of that. And on the flip side, the question of the Second Amendment. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about the goal of a conversation. Is it to understand? Is it to debate? Is it to change our minds? Or is it just to say, like, I respect that you have your belief and you respect that I have mine. We now understand each other's stories better. And that's better for society. The end.
And I was going to lead right into that question. There's a lot of misconceptions about dialogue spaces and just communication in general alongside conflict resolution. And I was going to ask you, you answered perfectly. What is the goal of having these conversations? Because many people think it is to just change your mind. And because you beautifully answered already, how would you think that this skill and these intentions transfer to the workplace for students?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you said, like, what is the goal? And that I just said what the goal is. I would say that every conversation has its own goal. Like, what's the goal of this podcast right now? To talk more about the importance of curious disagreement, to spotlight 3 different organizations that are working toward it, to maybe engage more audience members in the pod. There's all sorts of goals. You know, the goal of my meeting in a couple of hours with one of my colleagues is to make a decision on what we're going to do at this team retreat. Like, every meeting or every conversation has a goal, but often the more spontaneous ones, we don't think about that goal. And often where conversations go wrong is when 2 people have different goals and they don't communicate that in advance. That could be in a meeting where one person thinks today we're going to make a decision about X, and the other person thinks today we're going to brainstorm, and then both people are upset at the end of the meeting because it was an outcome they didn't want. Similarly, if I go into a conversation with you, maybe my goal is I want to understand better, Sam, your perspective on bananas or immigration or whatever the topic is. And if I start asking you curious questions and you start trying to convince me about bananas or immigration or whatever it is, I'm going to feel upset. You're going to feel confused because I'm not. Like, maybe you think it's a debate and I think I'm trying to learn. It's going to go south pretty quickly. But if we can think, at least for ourselves, like, what am I trying to get out of this conversation? We're going to change our behavior. We're going to ask, if the goal is to understand, more questions, listen for longer, like try and deepen our perspective. Whereas if it's to change each other's minds, we might use more, gotcha type of questions or leading questions. Like, there are different skills for different goals. And so keeping in mind the goal, I think, is often forgotten, but really important. And you had a second question about that.
And just, thank you. And just how are these skills and these practices
for the workplace.
Transferable? Exactly, for the workplace.
Well, we have different conversations all the time for different reasons. And at work, there are all sorts of reasons. Again, you might have a meeting to brainstorm. You might have a meeting to decide on a policy. And so these conversation skills, sometimes people think, well, I'm only going to do dialogue or the people who do dialogue do it because they are centrists who don't actually have any real beliefs, which I think is not true. Or they do it because they really care about civic pluralism. That's maybe true. Some of us do it for that reason. But it's also, as I mentioned, like, if disagreement is inevitable, it's going to come up everywhere. And so one misconception that I want to combat is that dialogue skills aren't just for people who love dialogue. Like, if you get your first job offer after college and they offer you a salary and it's lower than the salary that you expected, you need to have the skills to be able to respectfully negotiate for the salary that you think that you deserve. Or if you're called to HR about a workplace conflict, you need the skills to have that conflict. Or you and your coworker disagree on the best way to run a podcast or implement a program. Like, these are life skills. These are leadership skills. These are also civic engagement skills. I'm not saying that they're not. I don't want to minimize the importance of democratic or civic engagement, but that's not all that they are. And I think we as a dialogue space need to be better about thinking about, it's going to help you at work. It's going to help you raise a family. It's going to help you make friends when you move to a new state. So I want to expand what we think the goal is of dialogue and where it applies, because I really think it's an everywhere skill.
That's fantastic. And building that dialogue is actually a huge part of what we do at TPII. Whenever we host those breakfasts with guests like you, we'd like to invite leaders from the different registered student organizations, so that way they can learn from the different perspectives of our experts from all around the world. And they can take the skills, like disagreeing curiously and engaging in those dialogues, and apply it to their own spaces. So that's fantastic, having that applicability across different fields. Right. Speaking of applicability, the Viewpoints Project offers a fellowship program which trains students from partnered universities in constructive conversation and disagreement across these perspectives. Could you expand on this opportunity for our listeners? What other spaces, platforms, or programs do you recommend for those seeking to disagree curiously?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier in the podcast, but the way that the program works is we take these club leaders and we help them think about how does the goal of curious disagreement help them achieve the goals of their club. to align kind of the interest of the students. So this year we're partnered with 6 universities. We're always trying to bring on more for next year. So the fellowship is only open to students at those universities. Those universities are Dartmouth College, Elon University, the University of Delaware, Brigham Young University, Carnegie Mellon University, and the University of St. Thomas. But the mentorship opportunity is open to any college student, ideally not seniors, so not current juniors, because it starts in the fall. And that's an opportunity, as I mentioned, it's peer-led fellowship. So we hire college students who are skilled in dialogue to come and be fellows teaching dialogue skills to those fellows who are club leaders on their campuses. The application deadline is March 16th, so it's coming up. But we're really excited to build a culture of curious disagreement, kind of campus by campus, student by student.
That's wonderful. So our listeners, if you are interested in these opportunities, this is a fantastic chance to make an impact and start building that community. I believe that is our last question for the podcast today. Thank you, Shira, for sharing your own viewpoints with us.
I just want to reiterate how much of an honor it is to have you here. I mean, literally, Phoenix Generation is all about dialogue across differences, and to hear your perspective and the science behind having these difficult conversations is really enlightening. And I hope that you guys learned something new as I did. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you're seeing, if this resonates with you, if you want to know more, please follow along with our podcasts and check out Viewpoints Project. Thank you, Shira.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It was great to chat this afternoon.
Thank you again on behalf of the UCF Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. Thank you, Shira, for coming to speak with us today and for inviting us here on the podcast. To stay up to date with future events with experts like Shira, please visit our website at ucfglobalperspectives.org. That's all for this episode. Thank you guys so much, and we hope to see you next time.